Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast webinar, Oil in the News. Is Amazonia the Next Arabia? As we like to do here in the Brazil Center, we like to rip things from the headlines and show its relevance in Brazil, and to Brazil, and the dynamics more globally about the Amazon in terms of its dynamics in the global political economies and geopolitics. Well, whether the Straits of Hormuz are open or not depends on, I don't know, the various whims at the moment. I haven't checked yet today. But what is very important is that it certainly has revealed the precarity of the geopolitics of the Middle Eastern oil dynamics, and particularly the stuff that flows through the Straits of Hormuz. It's not that other areas that have plenty of oil have not been of interest or in the news. It's hard to throw your mind back to the beginning of January and Venezuela, perhaps. I think Latin Americanists have not forgotten this. And of course, there are, as they say, boots on the ground in Ecuador, and we have an Ecuadorian specialist with us as well in the form of Susanna Sawyer. So what we'd like to do now is really, I'd like to introduce to you our speakers and analysts so that we can go forward. Certainly, what this recent event has done has made people look around for new supply chains and also to look at other kinds of dynamics that maybe move beyond oil, such as the meeting in Santa Marta by 59 countries trying to look at the transition away from fossil fuels. So we know that transition is not going to happen with a click of a computer. So the question of the Amazonian oil resources, including that just off the shore that is still on the continental shelf, is of increasing interest. So, speaking to us today, we have Philip Fernside. He's a professor at the leading scientific institute in Amazonia called INPA, the Institute for Amazon Studies, based in Manaus. He's one of the most consistent analysts of the dynamics of land use change and the politics that underpin them, the legalities around them, and the larger processes of change in Amazonia. He's won numerous awards. He's had hundreds of influential papers um, that address really the contradictions and consequences of deforestation and the dynamics of development. He's been a consistent observer of Amazonia for his entire career and lives in Manaus, of course. He's looked very specifically at things like road building, the implications of dams and energy construction, the changes in political regimes and the hypocrisy thereof, forms of agricultural expansion and the dynamics of globalization, as well as climate change and carbon questions in the dynamics of regional development, its severe inequalities, and its larger term implications. So he'll be our first speaker. He'll be followed by Susanna Sawyer, who is a colleague from the anthropology department at UC Davis. She is very well known for her work, her ethnographic work on the what, and really in many ways thrust Amazonian oil economies into the spotlight through her initial work on called Crude Chronicles, which looks at the dynamics of indigenous politics, oils, corporations, neoliberalism, and the dynamics of the Ecuadorian state. She's looked at the complex struggles over territory, inequality, the questions of nation building and how resources work in nation building, and particularly those in Amazonia, and questions of sovereignty and legality, and how these ended up producing, in many cases, among the strongest indigenous movements in Latin America, sort of linked also to scientists, activists, civil society, and the broader questions of the meaning of development. She's also looked at other kinds of comparative studies on the politics of resource extraction across 8 countries, and a book that won a major award from the American Anthropological Society called The Small Matter of Suing Chevron, which basically goes into the largest liability of $9.5 billion in a contamination judgment against Chevron, and the complexities and dynamics and legal truths and how various jurisdictional dynamics and legal dynamics underpinned this process, and also essentially resulted in a question of how questions of legalities all operate, legibility and vulnerability operate, and suffering and how these configure risk and reward, suffering and surfeit, and become legally and unevenly distributed. So we have two fantastic commentators on a topic that is, as they say, ripped from the headlines. So let's start with Philip, and I think he's ready to go here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, let me give you an advertisement for that website here. Whoops.
Uh-huh.
This website, which has uh, much more than just my publications, but one of the things it has is a list by subject, and one of those subjects is gas and oil. So you can find a lot more about what I'm talking about here today. First of all, let's start with the end of the world auction in 2023, auctioning off oil and gas in the Amazon. So you have this area offshore, what's called the equatorial margin, including this red area, which is the mouth of the Amazon area. The Amazon River comes in out right here. These red blocks are the 92 blocks that were offered for auction in 2023. Not all of them were purchased. And the yellow are ones that are under study. Then you have this area around Manaus, where I live, where there were quite a few blocks that were auctioned off, including these south of the Amazon River with access from the BR-319 highway. You have this area under study here in Maranhão, and in Mato Grosso, this area, and a small one in Londonia that had a lot of blocks offered, but hardly any were actually sold. In another auction last year, there were just a couple of blocks sold in this Mato Grosso. And then there's this area under study officially, which is the part of the Solimões sedimentary area oil and gas project, a huge project. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes. First of all, the politics surrounding this are essential, and they're moving very quickly. This is BBC News saying about Lula's strategy to use oil from the Amazon in the election in 2026. In October this year we're having a presidential election. And Lula is running. And this is Davi Alcolumbre, who is a senator from the state of Amapá, which is where those offshore oil blocks in the mouth of the Amazon are. Very interested in getting those approved. And so a few months later in July, we had the Bill of Devastation, which is a disastrous bill, which was approved by the National Congress. It basically dismantles the environmental licensing in Brazil. And Lula just stayed out of this. And this included an amendment, which was added by Alcolumbre himself, with creating these so-called strategic projects. The committee could deem any project strategic, and then it basically would be automatically approved within 1 year. And this was specifically for getting the mouth of the Amazon oil fields approved. But it has much wider impacts. It includes all these highways and dams and so forth in the Amazon that can also get approved this way. So it's much more than just the impact of the individual oil wells. And after it was approved, Lula vetoed 54 clauses in the bill. But this one about the strategic projects, he made into a provisional measure, so it would take effect immediately, and it's still in effect. It's part of the law. And those vetoes were overridden, and the law just came into effect a few weeks ago. Now, just in the last couple of weeks, Alacumbri here on the left has basically changed sides to Flavio Bolsonaro, the son of Jair Bolsonaro, the ex-president, obviously with environmental consequences. Now, the current Lula administration is very much prioritizing oil extraction. Here's the Minister of Mines and Energy saying that Brazil will extract petroleum until the country reaches an economic level of the developed countries. So basically, the idea is to extract forever. And Lula has basically said the same thing. Here, Lula once again defends extracting oil in this equatorial margin, includes the mouth of the Amazon, saying that we won't throw away any opportunity to make this country grow. And obviously, the country's always going to want to grow. So it's basically a license to pump oil forever. Now, the logic behind this came out in this report from the International Energy Agency that was launched in 2021, which surprisingly concluded that there should be no new oil or gas fields started anywhere in the world. Should only use the ones that already exist and gradually reduce extraction until you reach net zero emissions in 2050. And the rationale for this is that the economic logic of starting new oil and gas fields is different from the logic of continuing to extract from ones that already exist. For example, in the case of the mouth of the Amazon, it's estimated it will take 5 years to begin having oil at commercial levels. And then it takes another 5 years to pay off the investment. And of course, no one is going to want to stop with zero profit. So it implies it goes going on and on way past the time when the entire world has to stop using fossil fuels. Important to realize that the International Energy Agency is not an environmental organization. It's 123 countries with headquarters in Paris, and generally they're on the other side of environmental issues. I've had some debates with them about hydroelectric dams, for example, and them saying that you have to stop means that it's obviously very serious. Now, there's a lot more information on the impact of this mouth of the Amazon project here in this text. And the link with this switch in the 1st of February when Alacumbri was elected president of the Senate. Now, the impacts go beyond the greenhouse gas emissions. Important to remember the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, when it took 5 months with the oil spilling out unimpeded before finally we're able to, with a lot of luck, able to plug the leak. Now, the water depth at the Gulf of the Deepwater Horizon site is 1.5 kilometers. So it basically showed that nobody in the world has the technology to plug a leak at that water depth. If Petrobras had that ability, they would have rushed in to help plug the leak. but not just them, but nobody else has it. So all of their rhetoric about how they have so much experience doesn't mean they have experience with this. And the depth of the water at this mouth of the Amazon site is double the depth at the Deepwater Horizon site. And it also has much stronger and more complicated currents than in the Gulf of Mexico. In the mouth of the Amazon, there's a current on the surface going from south to north. And then at 201 meters depth, you have another current going in the opposite direction. So if you're trying to lower things from on a cable from a ship on the surface, for example, a big concrete dome put over the well like they did on the Deepwater Horizon, it's much more difficult. And IBAMA, the Federal Environmental Agency, says it would impact 8 countries if they had an oil spill. It'd be carried up all the Guianas and into the Caribbean. Now, this paper explains the impact on biodiversity, not the climate part. But obviously, it would have tremendous impacts if there any sort of a spill. And it also impacts all these, these coastal ecosystems here that have traditional populations that are extracting non-timber forest products and so forth. And many dependent on fisheries as well. So you'd have a tremendous human impact from any sort of a spill. Now, there's another problem, and people have probably heard about the natural resources curse, or all sorts of mining, which includes oil extraction. And there's a significant social science literature on this about why it is that, for example, countries that had fabulous mineral deposits like Democratic Republic of Congo and Bolivia are the most miserable in terms of inequalities, poverty, and so forth. And that applies to oil and also with a lot of other consequences. They tend to become more authoritarian. You see countries like Russia, the Middle Eastern countries, Venezuela, and so forth with that. And you have much greater inequalities. The so-called, for various reasons, there's the so-called Dutch disease named after what happened in the Netherlands when oil and gas were discovered in the North Sea. I thought it was going to be a big economic bonanza, and actually all the social inequalities and so forth just increased. It turned out to be a social disaster. Anyway, it's already happening here in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon. Here, there's about 2 places, Silves and Coari, where you have gas extraction and royalties and so forth, and all sorts of these inequalities and so forth coming in. Of course, you also get corruption with this. Coari is notorious as the most corrupt place in the state of Amazonas. He's the mayor who's, well, and having fun traveling with the money from it. And it's already starting in Amapá, where this Mouth of the Amazon project is planned. There's more information in there. Now, another aspect of this is the way that the initial project there in the mouth of the Amazon was approved. You have IBAMA basically only concentrating on what would happen if you had an accident, how you could rescue wildlife and carry it to a base on the mainland and so forth. And they had Petrobras do a simulation where they would pretend to be rescuing animals and carrying them to this base. They had to do it in a certain number of hours and they failed. So IBAMA said they had to make a bunch of changes and do it again, but that was the stimulus for the final push of pressure from the presidential office, and they just approved it within a couple of days. So that applies to other things like this BR 319 highway, what happened there. This problem of several problems there. This way that it winds up getting approved and the the narrow focus of what the impacts of these projects are. And that applies very strongly to the BR 319 highway, which connects Manaus to Porto Velho and Rondônia in this arc of deforestation. The red area is deforestation. And that is a road that was built and finished in 1973, officially dedicated in 76. And then it was abandoned in 1988. And now there's a plan to reconstruct it, to build a new highway on the same route. And that the old route is being maintained since 2015. It's not, so at least in the dry season, it's now passable. Anyway, problem is that it's not just the highway itself. You have all these yellow roads here, which are state government highways from the state of Amazonas that would link to BR 319. It's 1,320 kilometers of these state roads, opening up this huge area of forest to the west of the highway, which is where this oil project is planned. So this is very tightly connected to that oil project. Now, the same area here, here's a BR 319 highway and these other roads. You see these gray areas, which are areas that are claimed by land grabbers. These huge area. Land grabbers are called grileiros in Brazil. This English language term land grabbers has a different meaning in Amazonia than in other parts of the world like Africa and Asia. Here it means these big operators who are Brazilian entrepreneurs claiming government land illegally, and then various ways they legalize it and resell it. In Africa and Asia, it refers to foreign companies buying land, private properties, agricultural land, and that then using it for export crops so the local population loses their food security. Anyway, these are huge areas. These are not the local riverside populations, traditional peoples there. And this brown area on the map, which is where the oil project is planned, is the biggest area in Brazil of non-designated public lands. This is government land that is the category that's most attractive for these land grabbers, for loggers, miners, organized landless farmers, and so forth. And that's what would be opened up by these roads. Now, this area that at the southern end of the BR 319 highway is called Amacro. This is where the borders of Amazonas State, Acre, and Rondônia come together. And this is now a huge hotspot of deforestation and fire. It's moving out of the traditional areas in southern Pará and so forth to this area. Huge fires. In Manaus, we don't have scenes like this yet. And this area in 2024, much of Brazil was covered with smoke, with hospitals filled with people with respiratory problems. And you can see that the main source of that smoke is exactly that Amacro area, the junction between Amazonas, Acre, and Rondônia. So the fear is that the processes there are going to move north using the BR 319 highway to this big area of intact forest where the oil project is planned. And it turns out that that's exactly what the plan is. So here, Alfonso Chagas is a sociologist at the Federal University of Rondônia who studies the entrepreneurs, the agribusiness entrepreneurs in this Amacro region. And concludes that after Amacro, they're going to move to these untouched regions in Amazonia, these three river valleys that are exactly what would be opened up from the BR 319 highway. So probably these entrepreneurs are the ones who would buy the land from these land grabbers that are already there. They aren't there, they're claiming the land. So this is the oil and gas project, the Solomon Sedimentary Area Project. You have the BR 319 highway and these other roads that are planned. There's another one I showed in that first map that was only announced in 2024. It cuts this way. And all of those green areas already have seismic prospecting for gas and oil. It's a huge area. Inside this red line project area, it's 740,000 square kilometers. So that's half the state of Amazonas, much larger than the state of Texas in the US, for example. And these brown squares here are the first oil and gas drilling blocks, 16 blocks that have already been sold to Rosneft, the huge oil, gas, and Russian oil and gas company, which is notorious. Greenpeace Russia accuses it of causing over 10,000 oil spills in the world. Also one of the biggest companies in the world. And the state government in Amazonas has an accord with Rosneft and considers it to be a priority undertaking for the state. So this greatly increases the probability that the state government will give priority to those roads that are planned to connect to the BR-319 highway, which would be a tremendous benefit to the oil and gas project, because it's much cheaper to have land access to these oil and gas wells than to fly around in helicopters pretending that they're platforms in the middle of the ocean, which is the official plan. So they would probably use taxpayer money to build these roads, which would benefit the company. And of course, the company is likely to build other roads of its own that open up more of the area. Now, that is one of the world's biggest companies, of course, has money that can influence the Amazon state government. And there's also the problem of President Putin, whose financial interest in Rosneft, well, the details are in this text. But there you have the likelihood of political influence in addition to the financial influence. So there's a lot more information in this text here about this oil and gas project, the Solomon Sedimentary Basin. And also about the impacts on the fresh waters. The oil spills have tremendous impacts in the Amazon. Certainly Ecuador and Peru have a lot of experience with that now. It's devastating. Of course, it's something that is likely to happen here as well. Now, in addition to that, you have another problem, which is the impact of climate change. Obviously, the impact of this oil project is not just the greenhouse gas emissions and the oil spills and the environmental impact of the oil wells themselves. It's also leading to the collapse of the Amazon forest in these areas. But from climate change, this area is problematic. This paper led by Bernardo Flores was published in Nature in 2024. Calculated that by 2050, 10 to 47% of the Amazon could be exposed to passing a tipping point, exposed to collapse, based on climate, basically. And the surprise was it isn't just this area in the southern part of the Amazon forest near the Cerrado that's already showing some signs of beginning to collapse. It's all this area along the BR-319 highway and most of the area in that Trans-Purus area, the region to the west of the Purus River that parallels the BR-319 highway. So those things together, when you have the roads built, you have deforestation, it's cut up into fragments, we have these fish skeleton patterns and so forth. You have it's much more fragile to collapse, and you add on to that this climatic impact, and also the likelihood of forest fires spreading out from the occupations along these roads, putting cattle pastures and so forth that spreads into the forest. So this exposes that huge block of forest to risk of collapse. And that area has a huge stock of carbon. This is a map from our group of carbon there was in 2013 and in these different no, excuse me, this map is what we call the pre-modern. There's another map for 2013. So it's before the Radam Brazil project in the late 50s and early 60s. Anyway, it's a huge stock of carbon there that is at stake, and it's also the most vital area for recycling water, which is essential for Brazil maintaining most of the agriculture in the country, and also the city of Sao Paulo, which depends on this recycled water that's carried by winds known as flying rivers. Now, let me just explain how this fits into the global question. This is the famous global stock take that was released in COP28 in 2023 by the Climate Convention. So you have the CO2 emissions increasing. These are what the human society is deliberately emitting. So basically, it's fossil fuels plus deforestation, totally unsustainable. And the path that has to be followed to stay within 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average global temperature, which represents a tipping point both for global climate and for the Amazon forest. And the important thing here is the total. You look here, it's 55 billion tons of CO2 per year being emitted in 2023. So 55 billion tons of CO2 is equal to 16 billion tons of carbon, if you don't count the 2 oxygen atoms in each molecule CO2. So that means that the most that we can do to contain global warming is to not emit any more. If we don't burn a single liter of gasoline, we don't cut another tree, it's only 16 billion tons of carbon. So what happens if what's coming to the atmosphere that isn't directly human induced, based from the Kyoto Protocol? It isn't burning fossil fuels and deforestation, but because you have more forest fires, because all the soil in the world is warming up and emitting carbon, including under the Amazon forest. Our group has shown that. You have tundra melting, exposing peat. You have all the oceans warming and not absorbing so much CO2. All of that adds up to more than 16 billion tons per year. Then global warming escapes control. It just gets hotter and hotter. There are more and more forest fires, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. And that part of the Amazon is critical to that question. So you look at the carbon stocks in Pan-Amazonia, that includes the other countries in addition to Brazil. We have a good number for Brazil, 59 billion tons of carbon, and about 20 in the rest of in the other countries. This is just in the trees and the vegetation. And then there's a lot more in the soil. You see that all those numbers are much bigger than 16, and summed together, they're way bigger. So just a tiny fraction of that going into the atmosphere in the course of a few years would be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of global climate, pushing it out of control. And it has a lot of impacts. It would be devastating for Brazil. You'd lose the rest of the Amazon forest, the water cycling function. Northeastern Brazil would turn into a desert. Tens of millions of people depend on agriculture there, and so on. And you also have mass mortality. You recommend getting into some of this literature. It's very frightening. But if you have peaks of temperature well over 55 degrees Celsius, in Fahrenheit, the highest heat waves you have now are about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So what happens if it's 140, 150, 160? People simply die. So it's basically an unthinkable scenario. But what you have is that problem of only looking at the close impact. So for the BR-319 highway, whoops, here's the Ministry of Transportation is concentrated on 170 passages for the wildlife to pass underneath the highway. Only focused on the roadbed itself, the asphalt, basically. What happens uh, in the Trans-Purus area on the other side of the Bruce River where this oil project is? It opens up 1,320 kilometers of state highways. That's not their problem. Same thing with Ibama. They look at a slightly wider strip along the highway, but it's only the federal highway. What the state government does, and all these other impacts are not their problem. So this uh, is related to two concepts here. One of them is the question of the banality of evil, which is very evident in the BR-319. Of course, also implied for that oil and gas project is also the case. So this concept was developed by Hannah Arendt, who studied an extreme case, which was a minister of transport of Nazi Germany, who was taken to Jerusalem for a trial. And the surprise was that he wasn't a moral monster like Hitler or Mengele or something. He was a totally typical bureaucrat who thought that, he was Minister of Transportation, just responsible for administering the railways, including the trains that carried millions of people to extermination camps. But he had nothing to do with what the rest of the government was doing with this. He hadn't killed anyone. It wasn't his problem. And it's exactly the same problem here. The Ministry of Transportation is to build a highway from A to B. And what happens, aside from the roadbed, is not their problem. Same thing with the licensing for the oil and gas and all of these oil and gas projects, including the offshore. So that's one problem. Another is the so-called strategic ignorance, where people, including, of course, a lot of politicians, will have psychological ways of repressing these problems, like mass mortality from climate change, for example, but also claim to be ignorant about what the impacts of these things are. And this has a lot of application to these problems, both for the highways and for the oil and gas. So there's in the case of the Brazilian current Brazilian administration, there's details in here. And so this BR-319 highway and all the other things that go with it, including that oil and gas project for the sedimentary area of St. Moines, all of that is tremendous impacts are explained here. And the question is whether the current administration will wake up to this climate crisis and all these things that are linked to it. And the conclusion explained here is that Brazil should abandon these plans for oil and gas. It isn't just a matter of added conditions to the licensing where we sign an agreement saying that they will have governance and so on and so forth. It's a question of whether you build these things or not, both for the highways and for these oil and gas projects. And the conclusion should be that the oil and gas projects are not taken on. So I will end there. I recommend looking these up. All these things you can get from that website, and of course also on the original publications.
Thanks so much, Philip, for this enlightening but also highly depressing narrative about what the dynamics of change and the interrelations between the new oil geopolitics and the continuing sagas of Amazonian occupation with its many nightmarish elements to it. Also, for those who are listening, if you want to ask questions, please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them. Going from this sort of macro view, I think what we'll do now is move to Susanna Sawyer, who has, so if we have this, extraordinary overview, what we have is a rather more different and detailed narrative that comes from Susanna Sawyer about those who are living on the ground with these kinds of transformations, particularly for oil. So, that being said, let's go with Susanna Sawyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. And thank you, Brian, for organizing this and inviting me. And Philip, amazing presentation. One quick question, just to think about time. Should you have a sense of how much time I have?
I think we can go until 4.
Okay, perfect. Great. All right. So, and then uh, let's see. Can I go ahead and share?
Yes, you can.
Yes, Philip, if you don't mind ending your screen share, that way Susanna can go ahead and start her share.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, this is always those moments of transition with our systems. Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Nice.
Let's see if this works. All right. Okay, so what I am going to do is I don't have a full PowerPoint presentation in the same way, but I wanted to share some images. So I'm an anthropologist, as Susanna said, and my research has largely focused in dynamics over oil extraction in Ecuador since the early 1990s, so 35 years. And what I'll talk about, what I'll try and talk about is a little bit of how what we're seeing now is an extension of what has been going on in Ecuador for decades, but it's an intensification of it as well, in the midst of an increasingly effective indigenous slash environmental opposition. So this is a map that is available on a public website with Earthstar Geographics, but I actually got hold of it directly through Amazon Frontlines. Amazon Frontlines is one of a number of organizations that are international. It is US based and has been working in collaboration with a number of indigenous organizations, many of whom are clustered within an indigenous, many indigenous nationalities, I should say. A number of them clustered under an organization called Alianza Sebo, but also housed within Ecuadorian specific indigenous federations. So here we have a map of the Amazon. Obviously, the perimeters of the Amazon get outlined differently in different maps, but this gives you a sense of the headwaters, right? And I'm going to try and, I'm not sure if I can also, yeah, okay, I can. So here we're beginning to see Ecuador. What you see here are oil blocks, and we'll get a little bit finer detail. Oil exploration began in Ecuador in the 1920s. This was after there were substantial oil discoveries in around Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, and various geologists, in good part funded by Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil, went to do exploratory work in Ecuador, in sort of this region of Ecuador, as well as in parts of Peru, mostly around Pucallpa, which is sort of, I think, around this area. Um,
Right. It's right
the-
there.
oh, was it on the map?
Yeah.
Pucallpa? Oh, there we are. Sorry, over
Yeah.
here. I was a little off, wasn't I? Sorry, over here. Wrong river intersections there. Um, so despite the fact that exploration had begun in the 1920s, the first actual production only took place in the 1960s. There were various attempts at drilling exploratory wells partly through the 1940s, then a bit of a hiatus, and then the late 1950s. But none of those discoveries, and there were exploratory wells, there were discoveries, but they were either um, the quality of the crude wasn't deemed to be good enough to match the investment it would take to extract them. So in the 1970s, Texaco, which is now Chevron, um, discovered petroleum in a town outside of a town called, well, it's called Nueva Loja, but colloquially it's called Lago Agrio, because Lago Agrio happened to be what the first Texaco discovery in Texas was, Sour Lake. So this town is colloquially known as Lago Agrio. The concession that it had in the 1960s, it gained its concession in 1964. The concession was huge. It went from virtually the foothills of the Andes all the way to the Peruvian border. Over time, and with various military regimes that were beginning to nationalize the petroleum and establish a national petroleum industry, the whole configuration of the oil concession shifted and changed. But so what you see here on this map are oil blocks, current oil blocks, and the yellow are they're the agropecuaria sites, lands. So not absolutely deforested. A lot of it is still forested, but it's forested with all sorts of, secondary, tertiary on types of vegetation. And then the green is areas that are more forested, the dark green, as well as the gray. I'm not quite sure why the difference there. And the red would be urban centers. So what Texaco had, let me just pull back a little bit. This is the border with Colombia. The concession that Texaco had ultimately went down like this and then over like this. Kind of a long concession with a little adjacent to the right. In this area, there's been just radical, dramatic transformations since the 1960s. Exploration, the first barrels of crude oil were extracted in 1972. And, as Philip was discussing, along with the drilling of wells come a whole plethora of roads, of primary roads, of secondary roads. Pipelines have to be built, sort of a huge manifold of pipelines, of the primary pipelines going directly from wellheads to what are called pump separation stations and pumping stations, and ultimately to a major pipeline that takes this crude west, up the foothills of the Andes, across the Andes, down the other side to the Pacific Ocean. And then the majority of this crude oil comes to Los Angeles or the Bay Area, a little bit up to Seattle, but the majority of it is California consumed, and as well as internally, nationally consumed as well. Since the late 1980s, Ecuador has been on a campaign to extend and open up more areas for oil exploration. And what you see here are various, the current manifestation of what those attempts look like. So the black, again, I should explain, these black concessions are, concessions currently under contract. Though the concession shapes have actually changed over time and who's operating them has changed over time, but it's largely, almost all of these are operated either by Petroecuador, so the state oil company, a Chinese corporation, there's been a couple in the works, and then YPF, which is a Argentinian oil company. And then in 2025, Ecuador opened up its most, I'm just trying to get to here we go. Ecuador opened up its most recent proposals for, they call them licitaciones, so they're leasing rounds to international capital. So this is the Andes Mountains, quite populated. From here, from Quito, there's a road that goes over to Lago Agrio. The road heads down through what was Texaco's oil concession. And then there's a road that comes across this way. And then a road that heads down, and then a road that heads down on the lower skirt of the Andes Mountains. There are finger roads all through this area that you can tell is inhabited from the Agropecuaria. But from here to the east, there are no roads. There is the same thing here. There are no roads through this area. There are no roads through this area. There are actually, believe it or not, there are no roads through this area. The different colors here in the background are representing indigenous nationalities. So that's what those colors are. Let me see if I can move this. Okay. And then on top of that, okay, so you have a history of oil development. You have concessions that have been in operation, the early ones since the 1960s, and then beginning to produce in 1972. And then you have an increasing number of oil blocks that were often cut off from what was Texaco's larger concession. And then these blocks here are called the Tiputini, oh shoot, there is a name for it. It's called ITT. All of these blocks here are all funneling into the same pipeline that's essentially going from Lago Agrio, that Sour Lake town, across to Quito. These blocks down here are heavy oil. What's being extracted is heavy oil. And another pipeline was built in the mid-1990s, kind of mid to late 1990s, to build a pipeline that would follow the original pipeline, this Trans-Andean pipeline. And then my first research project that I worked on was in an area where the oil frontier was moving south, and this was in the early 1990s. And it happened to be a concession that ARCO ran, and the concession looks differently now, but it's this concession right here. It's the only concession. It's run by Pluspetrol right now, Block 10. It's the only concession that's actually producing south of this region, of the former Texaco concession, essentially. This oil concession and these oil operations were quite unique And they were unique largely because of indigenous opposition and indigenous mobilization and the alliance building that was being built between indigenous nationalities and Ecuador's incredibly sophisticated political structure, indigenous political structure. And while they couldn't absolutely stop oil development in this region, although they did try very, very fiercely, the one thing that they were able to do was transform what those oil development projects look like. And just as real shorthand, there are in the ultimate concession that Texaco had, they built 300 oil, they drilled 300 productive oil wells, producing oil wells, alongside each oil well or 2 to 3 to 4 large waste pits. They could be the size of a tennis court, they could be the size of half of the size of a soccer field. And the oil wastes from exploration were dumped into them. And these pits were just dug out of earth. They were unlined, they were unsealed. As you know, this is the upper Amazon of the Amazon, so it rains intensely, even in this area where there's not primary forest anymore. Um, and of course, there was overflow, seepage. There's ways in which the waste infiltrated very local soil systems, but also hydraulic systems. And the second major project that I did, which Susanna talked about, was a lawsuit that was filed by indigenous and non-indigenous campesino peoples in the region against Chevron, who merged with Texaco, for oil contamination in the region, and claiming that it was substandard technology that led to these particular operations and to the environmental contamination and their subsequent health effects for decades to come. So what ended up happening then in this Block 10, because of indigenous resistance, was that the ARCO, along with indigenous leaders, managed to drill directionally, so they're not, so many oil fields off of one platform. They can drill at least 10 to 20 oil fields because they're drilled directionally. The wastes are differently contained. They're not in these open pits, and no roads were built. So, which is really significant because of exactly everything that Philip described. So that was the case. And even though up until recently, even though there were various attempts at also trying to lease all these oil blocks, which of course their configuration shifts and changes all the time, but there have not been any other leased oil blocks virtually until 2025. And this has been an initiative of Ecuador's current president, Daniel Noboa. Noboa is thought about by his critics as being Trumpecito. He's a small Trump, and he has very large plans. This is called the roadmap. It's called the roadmap for oil development. Large plans to entice more international oil to develop these concessions. And this hasn't been the first time. This happened in the 1990s. It happened in the 2000s. It happened in the 2010s. But this time, there's a little bit more concern, largely because in addition to proposing all of these concessions and wanting to set off this round of licensing, he built an agreement with Peru to use Peruvian pipelines. So these purple lines, these are Peruvian pipelines that have in part been operating, been functioning, at least in these parts of them, since the 1960s. This is a really old oil infrastructure as well. There are pipelines that go over to Talara, to Talara, where there's an oil refinery on the coast. And uh, first, there was some international oil interest in doing exploration work in this region. I'm not quite sure of the dates, but I'm guessing in the 1960s. But after the military coup in 1968, Petroperu essentially has taken them over, and they're extensive. The oil operations in Loreto, in this department of Peru, are quite extensive and incredibly remote. These are not there. There is a road that in part cuts across with the pipeline, but you have to remember that this part of the Amazon is not nice and flat, or not that any of it is all nice and flat, but it's incredibly mountainous. And so it's not as though there's a nice flat road that follows what the pipeline looks like on the map. And it's not a public road, it's a private road. Those parts of it that can be used, it's not it's an oil road only that's guarded, that's militarized to some extent for oil workers. So Noboa cut a deal with the Peruvian government to be able to have access and link up with these pipelines, which is pretty disturbing. And in contrast to what the history of oil development in this region has looked like, meaning that there have been all of these oil blocks up for, I'd say almost every 5 years or 6 years, they go up for international licensing rounds, and they just have never been snatched up. It's just too much money to invest in trying to do seismic work, let alone exploratory drilling. In 2025, these two concessions in blue were leased, and they're both to Ecuadorian. I think one is Petroecuador, and one is Petro Amazonas, which is a part private, part public entity. The bidding has not started for the rest of these, so we will see. But Ecuador has a little spark of hope, to the extent of obviously not totally halting this, but to tripping it up, to changing what it might look like, and in the best of circumstances to stopping it. And that is indigenous mobilization. Here, I will, hang on a second, I'll do one more. Can you see my screen, or do I have to
Yeah.
share?
We can see it.
Did you see Nemonte?
No,
Okay.
we see your previous thing.
Okay, perfect. Here, let me just, all right. So there have been numerous environmental leaders in Ecuador, and with new generations, new, incredibly inspiring mobilizers come about. Nemonte Nenquimo happens to be one of them, one among many. But there is this prize called the Goldman Prize, which among some environmentalists, they like to consider it the Green Nobel. And Nemonte was given this prize in 2020. She's not the first Ecuadorian to be granted this prize. This is a prize that grants, it's a substantial amount of money. It's like $500,000 to one environmental activist on each continent of the globe. And there have been probably 4 other Ecuadorian leaders in two times, so 2 of them together, who've also earned this prize, as well as, from Colombia, from El Salvador. I mean, and obviously from Brazil as well. And Nemonte picked up on and then has been at the forefront of expanding a whole campaign around insisting that any forms of development in indigenous territory abide by the International Labor 169 Code statute, of free, prior, and informed consent. And Nemonte isn't the first indigenous leader to bring this to a fore and actually halt um, oil development, but the first was in a long process that culminated in 2012. So ILO, Ecuador signed on to the ILO Convention 169 in 1998. In 2008, that convention became part of its constitution. In 2008, Ecuador rewrote its constitution quite substantially in some ways. There were two really major, a number of major, but two for our purposes, really important things that came out of that rewriting of constitution. One was that ILO Convention 169, meaning a mandate for free, prior, and informed consent uh, had to exist, had to uh, be unraveled, had to, be arranged with indigenous communities before any development projects, and specifically with oil development. And the other was that Ecuador stated that nature is a legally substantive person in Ecuador, and that it upheld, was the first state to actually place in its constitution provisions for the rights of nature. And so these two things together, both concern for indigenous rights and concern for the rights of nature, have come together in these really forceful alliances between indigenous organizations and environmental organizations. So the first one was with Sarayaku, which is a Quechua community very close to where I did my first research. I mean, in the same river basin, like half a day's boat canoe float down one of the main rivers. They had presented to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights a claim that Petroecuador, who at that point in time I'm sorry, 2009 was when they filed the claim first. At that point in time, Petroecuador was wanting to start seismic exploration in their territory, and they were absolutely refused. They said, no, this is not possible. And at the very least, you have to engage in free, prior, informed consent. And this was an incredible battle, but lo and behold, during the hearings in Costa Rica and San Jose with the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, after days of testimony, the panel of judges asking questions, they found the Ecuadorian state to be liable for not abiding by its own constitutional amendments and for violating the rights of the indigenous peoples in the area. And it turned out that it wasn't simply the community of Sarayaku, but it was the whole province, which is the province of Pastaza, which is a province in the Central Ecuadorian Amazon. So there was that. There, you can see here there are various other oh, I'm going to correct myself. The blocks that I pointed out, the blue ones, which have been reconformed into not two, but one, they were granted during these years, but nothing has happened to them. And it's largely because of indigenous opposition, and part of that opposition led by Nemonte, not only, but part of it led by Nemonte, who filed also claims in front of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, but also in front of the Constitutional Court in Ecuador. And the case in front of the Constitutional Court is what won her the Goldman Prize, because it mandated that oil operations in Guarani territory, which I'm going to show you where that might be. Hang on a second. My apologies.
Susanna, we should also take 5 more minutes and then we can have a little more discussion.
Perfect. So Guarani territory would be this territory right here. It's this territory, which also is superimposed on top of that is a major national park called Yasuni, which has also been part and parcel of the whole struggle against oil corporations. So I can leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, that's an incredibly detailed and rich discussion. Now, what I want to ask you about is there was that referendum called Leave the Oil in the Ground
Yes.
that passed and seems to be overlooked by the current president. Would you like to comment on that? Because it's amazing that there was a referendum to not extract oil. I
Yeah.
mean, this is, you know, almost unheard of. And it comes out of a long history of indigenous resistance, but also the incredible political work, but also the incredible contamination that went on as well. So, would you like to address that?
Sure, sure. So the referendum was placed to the ballot in 2023, right around the time when there were special elections for the president, and Daniel Noboa was elected, youngest president in Ecuador, 35 years old at that point. Um, and it was a referendum precisely around this area. This is a national park. It's called Yasuni. And um, the referendum was to take, so there have been oil blocks on at moments on top of Yasuni that were illegal, and the borders of Yasuni were even reconfigured to accommodate the fact that, oh, we have to go around these oil blocks. Then the oil blocks shifted. I mean, it's been a kind of a long saga. But in the 1990s, a small US oil company called Maxis had this block right here and started to develop oil out of that block. Some of this block is in Yasuni, some of it actually is not. But what the referendum said was by 2025, yeah, by 2025, all oil development in that region should end. Now, some of it actually has, and some of it has not. And part of that has to do with Noboa's politics, where Noboa says, oh, no, 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 we have more time, given the fact that, we're in our current financial crisis, as well as maybe you have heard, but Ecuador has been in a really horrific narco trafficking um, streak of violence ever since the pandemic. Um, and during the pandemic, actually, and past. And that as a result of that, Noboa wants to claim, I've got 5 more years to make sure that there is no more oil development in the region. There are huge protests around that right now, though, in part headed by the Guarani, because so the majority of the Guarani, which is the indigenous nationality that the woman that I showed a picture of, Nemonte, is part of, the majority of them live in this region. But there are a few clusters of them. The Tegeri are the most well known, I mean, in terms of name, that are voluntarily isolated communities that have had very, very little contact with Ecuadorian society or any other. And there's been, since the 1980s in particular, there's been lots of violence between the Tegeri and any entity that seeks to enter their territory. Um, so at this point in time, Noboa thinks that his regime has 5 more years, and his regime ends in 2029 if he's not reelected. And the indigenous peoples have been in total opposition. And the Inter-American Court has actually pronounced on this fairly recently that Ecuador has been violating the the referendum mandate to end. I mean, it's just a huge point of friction and tension.
Philip, certainly 319 has a large number of indigenous populations there. Do you want to weigh in a little bit on what's going on there?
Well, okay. None of the indigenous populations have been consulted. And of course, we have a situation in Brazil where Brazil ratified the convention, ILO 169, and then in 2004 it was converted into a Brazilian law. So there's been a long time since then, and all of these things are completely illegal because they're not consulting indigenous people as is required. Now, the convention states that any impacted indigenous group has this right to consultation. It doesn't have anything in it about a limit. There's only so many kilometers on a highway or whatever it is. And that's also the case with the 2004 law, which was republished in 2019, another number. But in 2015, there was an interministerial ordinance, which was issued that declared that anything in the Amazon within 40 kilometers of a highway or of a hydroelectric dam had to have this consultation. But obviously, this has a lot of impact on people who are more than 40 kilometers away. Even within the 40 kilometers, there are 13 groups, and only 5 groups are supposedly to be consulted, but nobody's actually been consulted. And then within 150 kilometers, where simulations show that there would be deforestation and so forth, there are 63 groups. And obviously none of those have been consulted, let alone those that are farther away. Because this highway, for example, would bring the actors from the arc of deforestation from the macro region into everything that's already connected to Manaus by road. And that includes the state of Roraima, which has a state government, which is considered the most anti-environmental of the 9 states in the Brazilian Amazon. The governor and main politicians even supporting the gold miners in the Yanomami area. And there are a lot of indigenous areas there. So obviously there would be exposure to impacts farther away. So the thing continues. They've just 2 days ago, they reissued these calls for bids for doing this reconstruction of the highway based on the law of devastation, even with no environmental license whatsoever. Yeah, you have the history, like Belo Monte Dam, for example, was obviously built after these, it became illegal to do these things without consulting indigenous peoples. And there's still over 20 cases in the courts against Belo Monte. And one of them was because of not consulting indigenous peoples. And one of them was actually found in favor of indigenous peoples. And then it was appealed to the Supreme Court, which then took almost a decade and then decided in favor of the indigenous peoples, but the dam had already been built. So you have all of these things that are happening now with the indigenous peoples downstream that have lost their fisheries and so forth, tremendous impacts. Yeah, and of course, there's a question of what's going to happen upstream, especially since there's another bill that's moving through the Congress, uh, Bill 191, which would open indigenous areas to hydroelectric dams, and also mining and logging and agribusiness. And that would open the opportunity for building these other dams that are almost all in indigenous areas upstream from the elements. So it's a very unfortunate situation. You have to remember that in Brazil, we have what are called the security suspension laws that are inheritance from the military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. But this allows an upper level judge to overturn any decision, judicial decision that would harm the public economy. And of course, can always be claimed these dams and roads and oil even is important for the public economy. So that it doesn't matter how many international agreements or constitutional clauses and so forth are violated, you can simply overturn this and go ahead. And this has happened over and over again.
So we kind of have two,
Around 20 times in the case of Belamonte and
we
the
have kind of
Tapajós
two,
dams, yeah.
two contrasting tales here. One which seems more or less successful, but I'm reminded always listening to this of the rather depressing point of Frederick Jameson, which is we'll see the end of the world before we see the end of capitalism. Do we have anybody in the chat who would like to make comments, or anyone who's listening in? Doesn't seem like it. I think everyone is kind of in a stunned crisis here. Do you have any final comments you want to make? And then I think we'll have to end our session.
Okay. Well, I think the audience here is probably includes a lot of students at University of California and so forth. And it's important to realize that they're at a critical stage in their lives and deciding what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. And the decisions they make about what they study and if they go on with their master's or doctoral thesis on and so forth, usually shapes what they do with the rest of their life. And hopefully some of them will decide to work on these problems we've been talking about, which involve decisions on oil, in fact, all these other project roads and so forth, and climate change. And it's important that people work on it, and it's also important that decisions be made that will be radically different from what's happening now. And the important thing is whether or not you actually to build these projects. It's not the details of what sort of mitigation measures there will be, if you have compensation for impacted groups and so forth. It's whether you do it or not. That's almost all of the of what determines what happens, not the things that are actually occupying most of the lessons in progress in Brazil and also in other places.
Susanna, you want to
Yeah,
sum up?
well, I mean, I think it is really interesting how different Ecuador and Brazil, the context is. And Ecuador is such a small country in comparison. And the indigenous population in the lowlands in the Amazon region have had decades now of being amazingly coherent. Of course, there's differences and there's moments of absolute incoherence, but there have been really very impressive moments of coherence. And that largely has come because of international alliances and movement with environmental organizations, indigenous human rights organizations in the global north, both United States and Canada, but also from Europe. And then for our students here in California, um, the petroleum, the crude oil that's coming out of Ecuador, as well as a good chunk of it that's coming out of Colombia, and a good chunk of it, not all, but a good chunk of it that's coming out of Peru is heading to the West Coast. And in California, it's heading to Long Beach and the refineries in Long Beach. And in Northern California, it's heading to the refineries in the Bay Area. And there are organizations, very grassroots, local organizations that have built alliances with local communities affected by that infrastructure in California, refinery infrastructure. And California-based environmental organizations, Amazon Frontlines being one, Amazon Watch being another, that have worked really, really closely in building up indigenous voices in Ecuador, but also in Peru, in Colombia, and really in Brazil as well. Amazon Watch has been working with Brazilian Indians for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And students can get involved in that. And next week, there is something called the Global Anti-Chevron Day, which is protest in front of the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California, set in the Bay Area. So,
We have someone on the let me just read that. Someone on the chat, which let me get to that. So what would Dr. Fernside and Sawyer say are the biggest hopeful impacts we can make in the sense of the political world going forward, as in, hold on, boom, 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 steering us in a better direction instead of focusing on economic gain. I managed to miss part of this here. Let's see. So it's pretty much that, as in the situation. Does the US still have any hope in steering us in a better direction instead of focusing only on economic gain? You want to hold forth?
The question is about the US. Well, certainly there need to be radical changes in the US policies in many
Yes.
areas. Certainly, all these things that affect climate change, the use of fossil fuels, US investments in other parts of the world. There's so many ways that we're going in the wrong direction. It will depend on politics in the US.
Yeah.
Who gets elected and what sort of pressure is brought to on this in terms of what is hopeful. Certainly the fact that there are organizations and so forth that are, bringing this information to the public is important. And obviously there are also organizations on the political side. And it also applies to Brazil and Ecuador. You have today in Brazil, many more NGOs, including hundreds and hundreds of grassroots NGOs that didn't exist 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental change. It doesn't mean that we don't have reverses either. Remember the Bolsonaro period here and so forth, and all sorts of other decisions and the various presidential administrations that they're going in the wrong direction in terms of the environment. So there are hopeful things that are happening, and it's important not to be fatalistic about it. That is, when people talk about the Amazon, and also often people talking about climate change and the global problems, it feels that, they're just spectators and, there's nothing they can do to influence it, but actually, um, these are all things that depend on human decisions, and it's a matter of changing what decisions are being made.
Susanna, why don't you end up?
Oh, well, I just would want to pick up on what Philip said and of the importance of how, um, although the United States is huge and our politics feel so distant and inaccessible in many ways, I think the examples from the Amazon um, demonstrate the capacity of local mobilization, of people affecting change, putting pressure on representatives, working with larger organizations to bring forth claims to courts for violations. I think to support those areas and agendas and initiatives and yeah, take part in them is just really important.
Well, we've seen two incredibly contrasting and interesting dynamics in play. So, with that, I really thank you both for taking the time this afternoon and this evening for you, Philip. And we'll keep in touch. We want to make sure that as the oil dynamics continue, that we sort of keep on this. This topic is not going away anytime soon, as far as I can see. So we're in for it in some ways. But in any case, I'd like to thank you both very much for your time and your attention to this. And I know that our students I have my students on and I have others as well. And also, we get a lot of action on our webinar sites. So even if people are studying or can't make it in this afternoon, they do go online later. So, on that note, I'm going to end it for you and thank you so much for your efforts.
Thank you.
And we see you. And
Pleasure.
everybody get the books, get the papers, go to Philip at impa.com and you'll have more papers than you'll ever want to be able to read. It'll be a tsunami of papers. And also the books of Susanna are fabulous. So on that note, I'm going to end, you guys. I'm going to end